On February 20th, the 27 leaders of the EU member states convened in a special session of the European Council to discuss the EU's finances. Specifically, they gathered to fix the so called multi-annual financial framework for 2021 to 2027. However, they did not agree because four countries, dubbed the Frugal Four, refused the framework that was proposed. In this video, we'll explain what the multi-annual financial framework is and what exactly it was that the Frugal Four took issue with. Before we dive in, a shout out to our merch store. We have a bunch of new items up, some just reflecting our brand, our characters, and our logo, and others just on the idea of the EU and European unity. If you like any of the designs or want to see more, then head over to our Teespring store. It's linked down below. As you all know, the EU does a whole lot of things when it comes to policy making, administration, and subsidising. All of this, of course, comes with a price tag. Thus, the EU needs funding, and member states must agree on who pays what. Of course, it's impossible to agree on contributions for an indefinite period. Therefore, back in the day, when the EU member states signed off the Lisbon Treaty, they agreed to make a planned budget every few years, fixing the contributions member states would have to pay for a particular period. This budget is the multi-annual financial framework, and is established for periods of at least 5 years by the European Council, where all heads of government in the EU come together, and it sets out what the main areas of spending for the EU are. It also includes an agreement on who is to spend what total amounts for the next period, and also an annual maximum to make sure that countries don't pay everything in one go, and ensure that a relatively stable cash flow is maintained. Since countries cannot oblige one another to spend money, the multi-annual financial framework must always be agreed unanimously among member states. You may already sense why this topic is politically sensitive. Payments to the EU by states immediately triggers national discussions regarding the EU as a whole, and on the costs involved. Furthermore, not everyone pays the same amount, and not everyone likes the things that the EU spends its money on. What's made this round particularly troublesome is, and you guessed it, Brexit. The UK has been one of the main contributors to the EU's budget, and in 2017, the UK contributed €7.43 billion to the EU, the equivalent of £6.55 billion, making it the second largest contributor after Germany in terms of total amounts. Relatively, the UK spent 0.32% of its GDP on contributions, ranking it fourth after Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands, who top the bill with 0.47% of their GDP spent annually on the EU. Therefore, it becomes obvious pretty quickly that the UK is leaving quite a big hole in the EU's wallet. The big question that faces the EU now is therefore, do we want to keep the spending pressure roughly the same for all countries, meaning that the EU's budget will shrink? Or do we keep the current total spending amount the same, even without the UK, resulting in every individual country having to pay more? Currently, the EU's budget is capped at 1% of Europe's gross national income, and keeping this level the same would mean that the EU would have to spend less money. It's mainly the European Commission, however, that wants the hole the UK leaves to be covered in order to be able to fulfil its ambitious targets. It proposes a raise of the relative spending from 1% to 1.15% of Europe's gross national income. The Commission's opinion is shared by a political coalition that call themselves Friends of Cohesion, which includes most of the EU member states. However, some resist the proposed budget increase, and without unanimity, there is no agreement. On the last round of talks, 4 nations did not come on board. These were the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria, and Sweden, the so-called Frugal Four. And when the Austrian Minister of Finance was asked how much room for negotiation there was, he simply replied, none. So it does not seem like these 4 are going to budge easily. But what is it they have against the new 1.15% spending? In a joint statement, the Frugal Four firstly expressed that their disagreement on a 0.15% increase is not out of scepticism towards the EU. On the contrary, they explicitly mention their commitment to the Union is stronger than ever. However, they say that the success of the European project is measured by our ability to deliver on our political ambitions and achieve tangible results for our citizens, not by the size of the budget. In other words, they discard the idea that increased EU success equals an increased EU budget. Instead, they propose to keep the levels of spending at 1% of Europe's GNI. They argue that in itself this is an increase, since Europe's GNI continues to grow, an increase they consider to be enough. However, there's a deeper reason why the Frugal Four are unwilling to increase the budget. That has to do with what the EU spends its money on, and in particular, who receives it. Much of the EU's money is spent on development projects and subsidies, from which some nations profit more than others. Despite all nations paying in the same relative amount, some countries actually end up receiving money from the EU because of these programs and subsidies. Specifically, there have been some European countries, mainly in the north, who have paid more than they received in return for quite some time. On the other hand, many nations, mostly in the EU's southern and eastern parts, who have only really been receiving money. It's therefore no surprise that the Friends of Cohesion coalition that supports the budget increase are mainly nations that are on the receiving end, calling for the expansion of EU funding of economic growth, agricultural subsidies, and innovation. Their definition of a sufficient budget is clearly quite different from that of the Frugal Four. The differences in receiving and paying money have, according to Frugal Four, gone on too long, and it's even set to get worse with the Commission's proposed increase. They accept that some countries will benefit while some other countries will pay. Some countries have stronger economies than others. Some countries have had to deal with the heritage of USSR rule or wars, and some countries have economies that are designed to profit more easily from a free, harmonised internal market than others. And this would include the economy of the Netherlands, that is for a very large part based on exports, with the country being home to the port of Rotterdam, Europe's largest port. Nonetheless, the Frugal Four want to draw a line here and now. Together with Germany, the Frugal Four would pay 75% of net payments to the EU under the proposed changes. This is not just because the planned increased, but because the Commission and the Friends of Cohesion want to let a mechanism called the rebate system run out. The rebate system, which Thatcher famously fought for in the 1980s, means that net contributors, those who pay in more than they receive, are given some of their membership fee back, simply because they don't see much of the contributions they make directly coming back to them. For the Friends of Cohesion, who tend to be net beneficiaries, this is seen as some countries ultimately getting a discount on their membership, simply because they don't benefit from it, in the form of regional grants, for example. The best way to explain this is as an insurance policy. Paying into the EU budget is paying for the policy. The Friends of Cohesion have actually used the policy and got back more than they put in. The net contributors, however, get a partial refund on their payment because they haven't used the policy, potentially pushing up costs or down the benefits for the net beneficiaries. Hence, the Friends of Cohesion being happy about the policy expiring. So there you have it. Brexit has once again helped trigger political tensions, disagreement, and disorder, but this time on the continental side of the channel. Is this the precursor to the downfall of the European Union? Probably not, since many nations, despite expressing Euroscepticism, or even having been punished by the EU like Poland, still receive a lot of money from the EU, while those paying in still feel like they benefit a lot indirectly. But as united as they may appear on wanting to continue with the Union, there's no denying that Brits are not the only ones facing difficult questions on how to move forward post-Brexit. No one knows exactly where this will lead, and in the end, we may see the Frugal Four giving in. After all, the four of them stand alone, even without Germany, who in the past has lent them some support. How do you think this will all end? Do you think that the current system of budgeting the EU is fair, or do you think that some nations end up getting a much worse deal than others? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments. You can also get involved in the conversation over on Discord. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more updates as the EU budget procedure continues, and also for more updates on the EU more generally. You can also hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like these possible.